40 years ago, a small town in Alabama was shrouded in fear when two teenage girls vanished on the same road, 2 years apart, and never returned. Police found a bicycle abandoned at the edge of the woods, a mud-stained piece of lace, and a scream that was never heard. As the investigation grew cold, suspicion, rumors, and fear tore the community apart. Anyone could be the culprit. 20 years later, what seemed like a small scientific discovery reignited the case, pulling everyone back to confront a past they thought they'd buried. This is the story of justice buried in silence, and the journey of the people who awakened it from the darkness. Before we dive into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys to uncover forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. On the night of September 17, 1982, the atmosphere in the small town of Prattville, Alabama, was filled with the characteristic tranquility of the American South. On the main street, the shops had turned off their lights, leaving only golden glows spilling from a few late-night diners and the chirping of insects in the fields. At the other end of town, in the First Baptist Church, Sarah Whitmore, a 16-year-old girl, a student at Prattville High, was standing with the choir rehearsing for the upcoming Sunday service. Sarah lived with her widowed mother, Margaret Whitmore, in a small wooden-roofed house near the edge of town, where the church bells each morning rang out like part of the daily rhythm of life. Since her father's death, Sarah had become her mother's sole comfort, obedient, friendly, and always admired by others for her gentleness and her clear, pure voice. That evening, Sarah wore the light blue sweater her mother had just washed, tied her hair neatly, and left home for practice. Under the church lights, she sang along with her choir friends, their voices blending with the old organ's echoes throughout the sanctuary. When practice ended, Sarah said goodbye to everyone, thanked the choir director, and stepped out into the yard. A night breeze carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh grass swept through the row of maple trees in the yard. She told two friends from the group that she would take a shortcut down County Road 40 to get home faster before the rain started. That road was narrow and deserted, flanked by fields and the edge of the woods, a path locals often avoided at night. Under the dim streetlights, Sarah pedaled away from the church grounds, her small figure fading into the darkness. The last friends who saw her still remember the light blue sweater and the reflection of light off her brown hair under the car headlights. When the clock neared 10:30, Margaret realized the house was still silent, the dining table cold and untouched, and the living room lamp still on. Anxiety rose within her, as Sarah had never come home this late. She called the church to ask, but no one knew where she was, then walked along the neighborhood, knocking on neighbors' doors. No one had seen Sarah since practice ended. By midnight, fear had turned to panic. In the small kitchen, with only the steady ticking of the wall clock, Margaret picked up the receiver, her hand trembling as she dialed the Otta County Sheriff's Office. When the voice on the other end answered, she nearly burst into tears, telling the dispatcher that her daughter Sarah Whitmore, 16 years old, had gone missing after leaving the church that evening. On the other end of the line, the dispatcher took down the information, reassuring her that he would alert the nearest patrol unit. Outside, rain fell lightly on the wooden porch, the street light flickering and reflecting on the window frame like the pounding heartbeat of a desperate mother. About 30 minutes later, a patrol car drove slowly along County Road 40, its headlights sweeping the edge of the woods before fading into the night. There were no signs, no sign of anyone. Margaret sat through the night in the living room, her eyes fixed on the window frame, waiting for the sound of a car engine or her daughter's silhouette appearing on the path leading to the house. But the night passed with only the sound of rain and the cold, relentless ticking of the clock. Early the next morning, as a thin layer of mist still clung to the rooftops and the surface of Otta County, the county sheriff's office was already lit up before dawn. Sheriff Earl Hawkins arrived early, sitting with a cup of cold coffee, intently listening to the recording of the missing person call from the night before. The trembling, halting voice of Margaret coming through the small speaker made him frown slightly. He set the cup down on the table, stood up, put on his overcoat, and told the deputy dispatcher, "Call everyone in. We've got a girl missing." He knew the new day had just begun, but for Prattville the familiar peace had ended the night before. He had served in Prattville for over 20 years, witnessing everything that happened in this small town, but he had never received a report that made him feel this uneasy. A good girl, the daughter of an upstanding churchgoer, missing right after choir practice at church, that was enough to stir the whole community before the sun even rose. At 6 a.m., Hawkins assembled the entire county sheriff's department and called for support from the Montgomery City Police. Word spread quickly. By 7 a.m., more than 30 townspeople, classmates, and church members had gathered outside the sheriff's office, volunteering to join the search. One group was sent to comb along County Road 40, the road Sarah was said to have taken the night before. Another followed along Otakargrik, where many thought she might have taken a wrong turn in the dark. Bloodhounds were brought in from Montgomery, their noses wet and barking loudly as they sniffed the sweater Sarah had last worn, brought by her mother. Shouts of commands, footsteps crunching on dry leaves blended into the tense air, where everyone tried to hold on to the hope that the young girl had simply gotten lost somewhere. Around 9 a.m., one of the volunteers, a school bus driver, spotted something shiny on the grass edge about 30 meters off County Road. When Hawkins and two other officers rushed over, they saw it was Sarah's silver bicycle. The bike was tipped to one side, the front wheel slightly sunk into the red mud, the chain still intact, the seat not shifted. There were no signs of a struggle or fight around it, just a few small broken branches and wet mashed leaves from the previous night's rain. A few steps away, caught on a low bush, was a piece of white lace fabric. Hawkins carefully picked it up with gloved hands, recognizing it might be a handkerchief or a torn piece of clothing. He noted the location, ordered the area sealed off, then looked toward the dense woods ahead, where thick canopies cast shadows on the damp ground. The search team expanded the perimeter, along both banks of Otakargrik. Some waited along the water's edge, others moved in lines through the forest, planting flags to mark searched areas. But the previous night's rain had washed away any possible traces, no clear footprints, no strange tire tracks, no clues leading farther. By noon, the scorching sun drew steam up from the ground, making the search even more exhausting. Margaret was brought to the scene to identify the bicycle. When she saw it, she burst into tears, while Sheriff Hawkins could only bow his head, clutching his notebook tightly. He instructed the officers to collect everything possible, soil, leaves, fabric scraps, and send it immediately to the state lab for testing. In the afternoon, Hawkins set up a temporary tent as a command center right along County Road. A map of the area was spread on a wooden table, marked with red dots for searched zones. News of Sarah's disappearance spread throughout Prattville. Stores hung her photo in their windows. The church opened its doors all night for townspeople to come pray. Meanwhile, the rescue team continued scouring the cypress woods, using high-powered spotlights and small boats to search along the creek. Every time they spotted something suspicious, a shoe, a scrap of fabric, an indentation in the ground, they stopped, examined it meticulously, but nothing was clear enough to follow. On the second day, the first seasonal rain poured down again, turning the ground muddy and washing away most of the fragile remnants that remained. Hawkins knew time was not on their side. With each passing hour, the chance of finding Sarah safe diminished. He still directed them to dig deep into every area, check every clump of trees, every patch of grass. The rescue team worked until dusk, headlights sweeping through the dark forest patches, but it only brought headshakes. When the third day ended, the search had expanded to a radius of more than 5 miles around where the bicycle was found, but still no results. Night fell, and Hawkins sat alone in the field office, staring at the map before him covered in notes. Outside, the chirping of insects mingled with the drip of rain on the tin roof. He felt the heavy weight of the silence of a missing person in a town that had seemed so peaceful. As the volunteer teams gradually headed home, he ordered the search to continue for another 48 hours, though in his heart, he knew the chance of finding the girl alive was fading. But in Prattville, no one was ready to give up, at least not yet. The search continued for many more days after that, crossing through the forests, creek banks, and even the red dirt roads around town, but no one found any trace of Sarah Whitmore. After days of fruitless searching, Prattville gradually sank into a vague anxiety. The once peaceful small town suddenly felt heavy, strangely silent. Sarah Whitmore, the good girl from the choir, had vanished without a trace, and that made everyone start looking around with suspicious eyes. When the police announced a temporary suspension of the search, rumors began spreading everywhere like a thin veil of smoke. At first they were just whispered stories in the coffee shop downtown, where housewives gathered in the mornings. Some said they had seen a green pickup truck driving slowly on County Road 40 the night Sarah disappeared. Others swore they saw a stranger asking for directions near the church. Those snippets passed from mouth to mouth day by day, embellished, making everyone believe they knew part of the truth. In the small community, where everyone knew each other, rumors spread faster than any police report. The first name to surface in the gossip was Tommy Ray Caldwell, 19 years old, a gas station attendant near the market. Tommy had a skinny build, spoke slowly, and often biked along County Road 40 to go fishing, matching the route Sarah had taken. That alone was enough to make many suspicious. A few said they saw him near the church that evening, though no one had clear evidence. When questioned by police, Tommy said he was home watching baseball with his mother that night, but her account was uncertain. Rumors immediately exploded. In town, people's looks toward Tommy changed. Some customers avoided the gas station where he worked. Kids were told to stay away. He didn't understand why everyone was shunning him, only that every time he walked into a diner, the conversations hushed. Sheriff Hawkins realized the rumors were getting out of control. Though he didn't believe Tommy was guilty, he still had to interrogate him to avoid being seen as ignoring it. The questioning was straightforward, but Tommy's disjointed answers only muddied the situation further. He said maybe he saw Sarah, then denied it right after. Hawkins understood he wasn't capable of lying, just confused, but the press didn't see it that way. The next morning, the Prattville Progress ran an article with a big headline, "Police Question Gas Station Attendant in Sarah Whitmore Disappearance." The article didn't accuse, but it didn't need to. The readers filled in the rest. From then on, the town was divided. Half believed Tommy was innocent, the other half thought he was involved. The Whitmore family faced even more pressure. Margaret received dozens of calls inquiring, even from strangers wanting to help find the culprit. She only stayed silent, growing more exhausted from grief and weariness. Meanwhile, Hawkins tried to maintain order and continue the investigation. The evidence, the lace handkerchief, soil around the bicycle, Sarah's clothing, was sent to the state lab, but the results were nearly useless. The rain had erased everything. No hairs, no fingerprints, no new clues. He had to put Tommy under discreet surveillance, hoping something clearer would emerge. But in the following weeks, life in Prattville gradually returned to normal on the surface, while inside lingered a prolonged unease. At First Baptist Church, where Sarah used to sing, every service mentioned her name in prayers. Yet, amid the hymns and scripture readings, there were still suspicious glances, whispered gossip behind others' backs. The Whitmore family nearly shut themselves away, no longer appearing in public. Photos of Sarah were posted everywhere, on stores, telephone poles, school bulletin boards, but gradually became part of the scenery. People passed daily. The story of the missing girl turned into the town's sad legend, retold until no one knew what was real and what was imagined. Sheriff Hawkins understood that without finding the truth, Prattville would live in fear forever. He kept the lace handkerchief in his desk drawer, as a reminder that somewhere there was still an unsolved mystery. But by the end of 1982, as winter arrived and the case made no progress, all hope gradually dimmed. That small town, after the shock, returned to its familiar quietude, only now that quietude was no longer peace. The winter of 1982 passed in the heavy, damp cold of southern Alabama. After the initial weeks of frenzy, the search teams gradually withdrew home, the posters bearing Sarah's photo fading in the rain and wind. From front-page headlines every day, the disappearance now merited only a few short lines in the local news section. Police still received calls reporting a girl resembling Sarah spotted in the neighboring town or along the highway, but every lead dead-ended. In Prattville, life slowly returned to normal, but an emptiness lingered in the townsfolk's gazes whenever they passed the First Baptist Church. Tommy Ray Caldwell, the young man once rumored to be a suspect, continued to be whispered about in the shadows. He was called into the police station twice more in January. Sheriff Hawkins, though unconvinced of his guilt, still needed to clarify the inconsistencies in his statement. In the small interrogation room, fluorescent lights cast down on Tommy's tense face, he said that night he might have driven along County Road 40, then switched to stayed home all evening. When asked why the change, he just fell silent, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. Hawkins tried to stay calm, knowing pressure would only panic the young man. The interrogation dragged on for hours, but yielded nothing new. Afterward, Tommy's file thickened by a few pages, but offered no answers. Police also checked the green pickup truck mentioned in the rumors. Its owner was a transport worker in Montgomery, with proof of working the night shift that night. Other leads, a lace handkerchief, soil samples, fabric fibers were sent to the state lab, but revealed no suspicious traces. The forensic technology of the time was crude, able to determine only the color of the fibers and type of soil, unable to trace a perpetrator. Every effort by Hawkins and the investigative team stalled at inconclusive evidence. Meanwhile, public attention faded, the press moved on to new stories, and Prattville residents grew weary of the gossip. Mornings at the Central Coffee Shop, once buzzing with rumors, now held only a handful of older folks reading the paper and talking about the weather. The Whitmore family lived quietly behind closed doors. Mrs. Margaret stopped attending church, refused all interviews, and avoided the pitying looks from neighbors. In Sarah's bedroom, everything remained untouched. The bed neatly made, a few photos on the walls, and the hymnal still open on the table. Tommy Ray left the gas station, taking a job as a mechanic's helper in the neighboring town. People still eyed him strangely, but said less about it than before. He appeared less in public, staying home with his mother, avoiding any talk of the disappearance. Hawkins drove past Tommy's neighborhood several times, seeing the lights on late at night and the silhouettes of mother and son at the window. He didn't believe the boy capable of such a terrible act, but a hollow space remained in his heart. In March 1983, the Sarah Whitmore case file was officially classified as unsolved. The summary report, over 100 pages thick, listed all searches, witness interviews, evidence, crime scene photos, but nothing sufficient for prosecution. Hawkins signed the final page, feeling as if he'd just punctuated the end of the town's hope. He folded the file, placed it in the metal cabinet, and locked it. Until something new comes up, he told his deputies, though he knew it might mean never. Time passed and Prattville gradually regained its everyday rhythm. Spring arrived, magnolia blossoms blooming white around the Central Park, partially veiling the painful memories. Only occasionally, upon seeing young girls biking through town, would someone softly mention Sarah's name. In rare conversations, folks speculated she might have run away, or been abducted by a stranger and taken to another state. No one knew for sure, and it seemed no one wanted to bring it up anymore. Sheriff Hawkins still made a habit of driving by County Road 40 on patrols, stopping to gaze toward the forest edge, where Sarah's bike had been found. He stood there for a few minutes, staring into the invisible void among the tree rows. Sarah Whitmore's disappearance remained a ripple in his mind, a question without an answer, gradually gathering dust under time's weight. When summer came, Prattville drifted on as if nothing had ever happened. Residents returned to the fair season, church services, and the familiar tales of a small town. And Sarah's case, though never truly closed, had become a faded memory in everyone's minds. 2 years had passed since Sarah Whitmore vanished, and Prattville had learned to live with that silence. Occasionally, the young girl was still mentioned in church services or small memorials, but most townsfolk had folded her story away like a sad chapter that had ended. Sheriff Earl Hawkins still kept the old file in his desk drawer, occasionally pulling it out to look through before putting it away again. He no longer expected a miracle, but had never truly considered the case finished. Until one summer night, in 1984, when the phone rang while he was on duty at the county office, and an officer's voice came over the line. "Sheriff, another girl's gone missing, on the old road." The girl was Amy Collins, 17, a high school classmate of Sarah's daughter of a small shopkeeping family in the Central District. That evening, Prattville was hosting its annual county fair at the open lot near Highway 14, with a Ferris wheel, food trucks, and bright lights everywhere. Amy was volunteering at the church's baked goods booth, selling items to raise money for charity, alongside friends. After the fair wrapped up around 9:30 p.m., she said she'd catch a ride home with a friend, but some witnesses recalled Amy deciding to walk, since her house wasn't far. She left the fairgrounds, carrying a small purse and a light jacket, planning to cut across County Road 40 to get home. It was the very road Sarah Whitmore had last traversed 2 years earlier. When the clock struck 11 p.m. and Amy still hadn't returned, her parents called her friends, then contacted the police. Hawkins immediately recalled the familiar unease from 2 years prior. He and the officers headed to the fairgrounds, questioning those still packing up. A truck driver said he'd seen a young girl walking along County Road, less than a mile from where Sarah had vanished, but wasn't sure if it was Amy. That night, a drizzle began to fall, the dim streetlights casting a hazy glow on the wet road, as if time had rewound to 1982. The next morning, the search was mounted on a larger scale than before. Rescue teams from Montgomery were dispatched to assist. Groups scoured the cypress woods and the banks of Otaga Creek. Hawkins, now with graying hair, led the main team. He understood this disappearance couldn't be mere coincidence. As he passed the spot where Sarah's bike had been found, a chill ran through him. The red soil there was old, but the haunting felt brand new. That afternoon, a group of volunteers discovered Amy's shoulder bag strewn at the forest edge, just a few hundred meters from County Road. Inside were her wallet, lipstick, and a broken barrette. No signs of a struggle, but the bag was dirty and caked with the distinctive red mud from the land around the creek. Police cordoned off the area, collecting all evidence, including a small red fabric scrap caught on a low branch. Hawkins immediately noted the similarities: mud identical to the site of Sarah's disappearance, and the location still that isolated stretch of woods between Prattville and Otaga Creek. The whole town was stunned as word spread. 2 young girls, same school, same route, vanished just miles apart. Public opinion instantly linked the cases. The Prattville Progress ran the headline, "Nightmare Returns, a second girl missing on County Road 40. Those who'd tried to forget Sarah's story now recounted it in trembling voices. Children were barred from going out after dark. Parents escorted kids to school. Fear spread faster than official updates. In the sheriff's office, Hawkins placed 2 photos side by side, Sarah and Amy. Their similarities sent shivers down his spine. Both brown-haired, slight builds, bright and gentle faces. He no longer believed in coincidence. Though lacking proof, every instinct told him the one who'd made Sarah vanish 2 years ago had returned. He ordered a full review of the old files, combing through the 1982 witness list, including Tommy Ray Caldwell. This time, everything had to be done more thoroughly. No one else could disappear. As night fell, police set up camp right on County Road, floodlights blazing across the forest. A light rain pattered down, puddles forming around the tires. Hawkins stood motionless, gazing into the darkness where the creek's murmur rose steadily like the earth's breath. He knew Amy's disappearance didn't just reopen an old file, it dragged the whole town back into the nightmare. One it seemed Prattville had never truly escaped from the start. That night, Sheriff Hawkins barely slept. He sat in the makeshift field office set up on County Road, the small beige shoulder bag the volunteers had just found in front of him. Dim fluorescent light illuminated the thick red mud caked around the zipper. Inside, everything had been catalogued and sealed: wallet, lipstick, a folded scrap of paper, and especially the broken barrette, along with the mud-stuck red fabric. Hawkins carefully examined it through the plastic bag, his heart heavy. No body, no signs of struggle, but he knew this was where Amy Collins's story had halted. The next morning, the woods near Cypress Pond were fully cordoned off. It was low-lying land, thick with reeds and old cypress trees, just a few miles from Otaga Creek. The forensics team from Montgomery arrived, setting up a tent amid the damp, chilly forest. Technicians methodically photographed, measured, and collected every tiny piece of evidence: snapped branches, skid marks in the soil, even stray hairs on the grass. Under the hazy sunlight, mist rose from the ground, the scent of mud mingling with the gasoline fumes from police vehicles in an indescribably oppressive atmosphere. Amy's bag had been found at the forest's fringe, near a path leading down to the pond. The spot was about a kilometer from where Sarah Whitmore's bike had been discovered. Hawkins eyed the topographic map spread on the table and saw the two red dots nearly overlapping. A cold prickle ran up his spine. The one who'd taken Sarah 2 years ago could still be somewhere around here, watching their every move. He ordered the search radius expanded by half a mile around the pond, while also having the full list of residents along the route rescreened. Meanwhile, the temporary lab set up at the forest edge conducted preliminary tests on the evidence. The small red mud-stuck fabric was identified as from a common wool sweater, possibly the victim's, but could belong to someone else. The barrette bore a few scratches and a streak of dried dark brown mud. Though deeper analysis wasn't yet possible, the experts agreed the bag couldn't have been left randomly. Someone had deliberately tossed it into the underbrush, or carried it and discarded it upon leaving. By afternoon, news of the find swept through Prattville. Local TV vans lined the forest entrance, reporters interviewing residents, while police erected barriers to keep out the curious. Amy's family was on site, but asked to stay in the safe zone. Her mother, Mrs. Elaine Collins, stood motionless gazing along the tree line, her eyes vacant. She said only one short sentence to Sheriff Hawkins: "It's just like the last time." He didn't reply, just nodded. In the days that followed, the search teams worked relentlessly. Divers were brought in to probe the pond bottom, while other groups combed every patch of grass, every tree root around Cypress Pond. They found faint shoe prints, possibly from rescuers or volunteers, but nothing definitive. Each item was numbered, documented, and sent to the analysis center. Preliminary results confirmed: no signs of a major struggle, no blood on site, no evidence the victim was attacked there. Yet the location seemed to be where Amy had last appeared, as the bag and personal items indicated she'd carried them right up to the end. On the third night, as the search paused, Hawkins stood by the pond shore gazing at the still water reflecting the dim moonlight. He heard the insects, the wind rustling the reeds, and suddenly recalled the first night searching for Sarah 2 years ago, the scene nearly identical. A nagging intuition stirred in him that the perpetrator hadn't chosen this spot randomly. It was familiar with the area, knew exactly where it was remote, where traces could be easily disposed of. That one's local, he thought, someone who knows Prattville inside out. The next morning, an emergency meeting was held at the county office. Investigators presented their reports. The primary scene was likely in the woods around Cypress Pond, where the bag was found. Hawkins concluded both disappearances, Sarah in 1982 and Amy in 1984, were the work of the same person. He ordered a special task force formed, the entire old file pulled, and the list of potential suspects reviewed. Tommy Ray Caldwell, though he'd left Prattville, was reinstated on the interrogation list. Police knocked on doors throughout the area, asking about strangers, trucks, or any unusual noises on fair night. That evening, as police packed up from the woods, rain began to fall. Mud bubbled under the tires, a musty dampness seeping into the air. A young officer asked Hawkins if he thought they'd find Amy. He replied softly, "We'll find out what happened here, whether she's alive or not." Then he turned to gaze back at the dark forest where the small bag had been found, a lifeless object, but now the most crucial piece in the hazy puzzle of the one behind the two disappearances that had robbed all of Prattville of peaceful sleep. When darkness swallowed the cypress woods and the police cars drove away, the rain that night seemed to awaken all of Prattville from the false peace the town had tried to cling to for the past 2 years. The next morning, news of the discovery of Amy Collins's purse appeared on the front page of every newspaper in Alabama. Local TV channels replayed footage of police setting up camp by the lake, rain-soaked white tarps, and the weary figure of Sheriff Earl Hawkins. The story spread instantly across the state, dragging panic that enveloped the small town. Parents kept their daughters at home, stores closed earlier than usual, and County Road 40, the once quiet road leading toward the woods, now became a symbol of fear. Old rumors resurfaced, this time more fiercely than ever. In coffee shops, on church porches, at gas stations, people whispered that the one who took Sarah Whitmore had returned. Some said they saw a dark-haired man standing at the edge of the woods the night before. Others swore they heard a truck engine rumbling in the dead of night. Each story was embellished further, each distorted detail making the atmosphere even more suffocating. Out-of-state media descended, setting up cameras right outside the county sheriff's office. They interviewed residents, asking about the Prattville serial killer, turning the small town into the center of national attention. In the midst of that chaos, the name Tommy Ray Caldwell was mentioned once again. The press dug up old files, writing that the man once investigated in the 1982 disappearance still lives near the Cypress Woods area. Tommy, now working at a machine shop in Wetumpka, was swarmed by reporters right at his workplace. He said he knew nothing about Amy, but his frightened eyes and stammering speech only convinced people more that he was hiding something. When the information reached Sheriff Hawkins's ears, he was forced to act, not just out of investigative duty, but also to calm the boiling public opinion. Tommy Ray was summoned to the Prattville police station one August morning. The interrogation room was still the same old one, with a scarred wooden table and walls covered in gray paint. Hawkins sat across from him, trying to keep his voice calm. He asked the same questions he'd asked 2 years before. Where were you the night Amy disappeared? Did you drive down County Road 40? Did you see anyone suspicious? Tommy hemmed and hawed, sometimes insisting he was home, other times saying, "Maybe I drove through that area." When the clerk read back the transcript, he nodded and signed it, not realizing that every word in it would be exploited to the hilt by the press. That afternoon, the TV news opened with police re-interview old suspect in Prattville's second disappearance. The phrase "old suspect" was like pouring gasoline on the fire. The townspeople divided into two camps. One believed Tommy was behind both cases, that the police were just covering for him because he was slow. The other, smaller but steadfast, thought he was just a scapegoat for a botched investigation. The home of Tommy's mother and son was pelted with rocks at night. Someone scrawled "murderer" in red paint on the garage door. Hawkins posted guards around their house for a few nights, but he knew he couldn't protect them from the town's caustic stares. Meanwhile, the labs reported back that the new evidence from the Amy Collins case, the purse, the hair clip, the red fabric scrap, yielded no concrete results. No fingerprints, no blood, nothing directly linking to anyone. DNA testing technology was still too rudimentary to extract information from such small samples. The police had no legal grounds to charge Tommy Ray or anyone else. Everything fell into deadlock once again. By the end of 1984, with no new developments, the press pulled out, and the townspeople grew weary of the prolonged fear. Prattville returned to its quiet facade, but no one believed in the safety here anymore. Church gatherings thinned out, doors and windows were locked tighter, and every time a young girl stayed out late, mothers glanced at the clock with worried eyes. In February 1985, at a meeting with county officials, Sheriff Hawkins was forced to sign the paperwork to temporarily close the Amy Collins file. The words "unsolved," "inactive file" were typed into the system, right below Sarah Whitmore's name. The two names now stood side by side, as symbols of what Prattville wanted to forget, but couldn't. Hawkins stared at the typewriter screen, his hand pausing for a moment before hitting the final key. He knew he'd just written another failure into the town's history. Outside, dusk fell over the cypress trees around Cypress Pond, where the wind over the water carried the scent of mud and the echo of two names that Prattville would never truly forget. The 1985 dusk that closed the Amy Collins file was also when Prattville entered a long period shrouded in heavy silence. Day by day, what had once shaken the town was gradually dusted over by time. People carried on with their lives, reopening stores, holding church services, welcoming new babies, but somewhere in each person's heart, a silent fear lingered. They no longer spoke of Sarah Whitmore or Amy Collins, but no one let their daughters walk alone after dark anymore. County Road 40 became a forgotten road, overgrown with weeds, and few dared to pass through it. Sheriff Earl Hawkins stayed on in Prattville, even as many of his contemporaries retired. He was promoted, then voluntarily returned to his old position, because he didn't want to leave the small office tied to those investigative years. In the steel filing cabinet right behind his desk, two case files wrapped in brown envelopes still lay in their place. Once a year on Sarah's birthday, he pulled them out, rereading every line of notes, witness statements, yellowed crime scene photos. Each time the feeling of failure returned, keeping him awake all night. He still believed that somewhere in this town, the person responsible for both disappearances was living an ordinary life, like everyone else. Years flowed on, technology changed, new people came and went, but those two names remained in the unsolved list. Occasionally, when a similar case cropped up in another state, reporters called for his opinion, and Hawkins only replied curtly, "We haven't given up." But he knew the truth was that it had all stopped long ago. No more budget, no more dedicated personnel, just his personal obsession keeping him tethered to the old paperwork. By the late 1990s, Prattville had changed a lot. New factories sprang up, highways expanded, young people left for city jobs. To the new generation, the Sarah and Amy cases were just stories retold in roadside diners, a local legend, half true, half imagined. But for those who had lived through those years, every time they drove past Cypress Lake, they still got chills down their spine. The wind over the water carried old memories, reminding them that Prattville's peace was just a thin shell covering what had never been resolved. As for Hawkins, now with silver hair and a stooped back, he still passed by the office every morning, even though he was semi-retired. Every time he saw the filing cabinet, he thought of the two girls' eyes in their portrait photos, and wondered if justice would ever find its way back here. For nearly 2 decades, the case stood still like the town itself, silent, weary, and no one daring to mention it. In early 2002, when Sheriff Earl Hawkins had turned 70, and held only an honorary advisory role in the Prattville police force, a letter from the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences arrived at the county office. The letter bore the official state lab seal, announcing that the agency was launching a special program, reviewing and retesting unsolved cases with preserved original evidence. The name Sarah Whitmore, Amy Collins 1982, 1984, was on the proposed list. Hawkins, who had thought the investigation dead long ago, sat in silence for a very long time after reading it. He glanced at the old iron cabinet, where those two files still lay, he never imagining that nearly 20 years later, they would be reopened because of something he'd never even dreamed of. Science. In Montgomery, Dr. Rachel Monroe, 32, a DNA analyst freshly transferred to Alabama from a federal lab, was one of the new generation of scientists trained in STR, short tandem repeat DNA testing, the technology replacing outdated serology and enzyme methods. When reviewing the list of unsolved cases, she noticed the Prattville file. The evidence was noted as preserved dry intact, rare for a case that old. Monroe immediately contacted the county office to confirm storage conditions. 3 days later, the old evidence box was shipped to Montgomery, seals still intact. When peeling back the thick discolored tape, Monroe carefully laid each item on the workbench. It was a broken black hair clip, a piece of white lace fabric, and a red fabric scrap caked in mud. Items that seemed meaningless in the Amy Collins file. Under the specialized UV light, each tiny piece seemed to hold a 2-decade story. She read the old description: possible evidence belonging to victim or perpetrator, gender undetermined. In 1984, technology wasn't sophisticated enough to extract any genetic material from the scant cells clinging to the surfaces. But in 2002, it was different. STR allowed detection and amplification of DNA from minute traces, even just a few skin cells. Monroe immediately submitted a testing plan to her superiors. She explained that if the evidence was still intact and uncontaminated, there was a real chance of finding DNA traces from someone other than the victim. Though Prattville was just a cold local case, the lab director approved the test, seeing it as a trial run for the new program. A few days later, the samples were moved to the clean room. Monroe and her team of technicians began the extraction process, a job requiring patience and precision. The first sample, the hair clip, was soaked in a cell lysis solution. After hours, under the microscope, faint DNA strands appeared, not enough for identification, but enough to confirm DNA from 2 different individuals, one female matching the victim's profile, the other male. Monroe noted the result with a mix of excitement and caution. She moved on to the lace fabric scrap, thought to be Sarah's, found near the bicycle in 1982. Even after 20 years, the fiber structure was still good thanks to dry storage. The test results left the whole team silent. This sample also held faint male DNA, with segments matching those from the hair clip. What had seemed like separate cases could now be linked by that very trace. That afternoon, Monroe sat alone in the empty lab. On the table, 2 result sheets lay side by side, repeating number sequences in pairs, something that could only happen if the same person had left traces at both scenes. She knew this wasn't coincidence. With further analysis using multiplex STR technology, they could confirm it with near absolute accuracy. She called Prattville. On the other end, Hawkins heard the young woman's voice, calm yet firm. "Sir, I believe we have a common lead for both cases." He was silent for a few seconds, then replied softly, 20 years, and finally, we're hearing from the past. The next day, Hawkins drove to Montgomery with the old files. When he met Monroe, he was stunned by the difference between the modern tech world and the outdated methods he'd once used. He stood watching her work through the protective glass, tiny vials holding microscopic DNA samples. To him, it was the miracle that 1980s cops could only dream of. For the first time in years, the Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins cases were marked active in the database. In the report sent back to Prattville, Monroe wrote concisely, "Need reference DNA samples from all persons interviewed in both cases. Evidence of linkage between the 2 scenes." Hawkins read those words, and the old feeling surged back, the drive he'd once lost. He understood that the justice Prattville had waited 20 years for was being awakened, not by a new witness, but by a science that on the day he started the investigation, the world didn't even know existed. Sheriff Earl Hawkins sat pensively at his desk, his eyes lingering on the line in Dr. Rachel Monroe's report. "Need to collect reference DNA samples from all previous suspects, 2 decades had passed, and that one sentence was enough to awaken every memory he'd tried to bury. On the old wooden desk, the files of Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins still lay in place, the paper yellowed, the ink nearly faded. For the first time in many years, Hawkins felt hope, not from confessions or luck, but from something he'd once considered remote: science. He called Monroe the very next morning. Her voice came through the phone, firm. "We've confirmed it. The male DNA appears in both cases from the same person." Hawkins fell silent for a few seconds, only hearing the whir of the centrifuge echoing from the lab. 20 years, he murmured. "And finally, he's left a trace." Monroe replied, "STR technology has advanced further than you think, Sheriff. Now we just need to find the person carrying this DNA." The news invigorated Hawkins. He went to the county office and reopened the old files. The name Tommy Ray Caldwell appeared first, followed by those who'd been interrogated in 1982 and 1984. He marked each one, then called an emergency meeting with the young investigators. Many of them hadn't even been born when the cases happened, but they still listened as he recounted the 2 missing girls, County Road 40, the disappointment that had once bowed the whole town. "Now it's your turn to finish this," he said. "With something my era didn't have, DNA." That afternoon, Hawkins drove to Montgomery. Monroe greeted him in the bright white lab room. On the screen, the DNA graphs were clear, columns of numbers matching between the 2 cases. "This is proof that the same person did both," Monroe explained. "If we get a matching DNA sample, it will all be over." Hawkins stared at the impassive numbers, his heart pounding. "How many people need testing?" he asked. "All of them," she replied. "Anyone who was ever interrogated, anyone who lived in that area. Voluntary, if possible, by court order if necessary." Back in Prattville, Hawkins held a press conference right in front of First Baptist Church, where Sarah had sung for the last time. He officially announced the reopening of the case, thanks to advances in DNA technology. The townspeople listened in silence. Margaret Whitmore, with her snow-white hair, sat in the back row clutching an old handkerchief tightly. When he said, "We believe the 2 cases have the same perpetrator," she burst into tears, her sobs echoing in the crowd's silence. After the conference, Hawkins knew he'd just stirred up what Prattville had tried to forget for 20 years, but it was also the first time he'd brought them real hope. The voluntary DNA collection campaign began the following week. Police knocked on doors, requesting blood or saliva samples. Most cooperated, a few reacted violently, claiming they were offended. Hawkins tried to stay calm, reminding them this was their only chance to prove their innocence. In a few weeks, over 300 samples were collected and sent to Monroe's lab. In Montgomery, Monroe's team worked almost non-stop. They encoded each sample and fed it into the STR system. One late afternoon, while comparing results, Monroe saw one sample with indices nearly matching the crime scene DNA, similar enough to suspect a blood relation. She called Hawkins immediately. "I think we're getting closer. This sample could be a relative of the perpetrator." Hawkins gripped the phone tightly, his heart racing. 20 years ago, he'd thought all hope was dead. Now a line of data on a screen could reopen the door to justice. In October 2002, the campaign expanded across Autauga County. The press called it the largest DNA hunt in Alabama state history. Hawkins and Monroe became the duo mentioned on TV, an aging cop who'd devoted his life to the case, and a young scientist who believed in the power of technology. They received hundreds of sealed envelopes each week, each one an opportunity to end the 2-decade nightmare. One late evening, as Monroe closed the lab, Hawkins called her from his small office. "If Sarah and Amy were still alive, they'd be proud of you," he said. Monroe replied softly, "I'm just listening to them tell the story in the language we understand best, DNA." Both fell silent. Outside, the night wind blew through the pines around Prattville, carrying the promise that the past was about to be named. The night wind still blew through the pines around Prattville as Operation Dragnet officially launched. From early morning, the town center hall, once the site of spring festivals, now turned into a DNA collection point. Police set up tables, posted banners reading "Community DNA Collection," inviting every man who'd lived around County Road 40 in the 1980s to register. The atmosphere was heavy, mixed with curiosity and fear. Sheriff Earl Hawkins, though aged, was there every day. He stood by the door, watching each person enter, shaking their hands, thanking them for cooperating. "No one is being forced," he repeated, "but each sample could help bring justice for Sarah and Amy." Most agreed. They lined up neatly, submitted blood or saliva samples, signed, and left. However, there were protesters. Some middle-aged men shouted that the police were treating the whole town like criminals. A local paper even called it a technological witch hunt. Hawkins didn't retaliate, just said curtly, "We're not hunting people, we're hunting the truth." In 2 weeks, nearly 300 samples were collected. The police team worked day and night to check paperwork, signatures, and encode data sent to Montgomery. In that crowd, one person caught Hawkins' eye: Jesse Pike, 48, a baker in Montgomery. He was tall, slightly thin, with a soft and polite voice. When filling out the form, Pike noted that he'd lived in Prattville, on County Road 40, from 1981 to 1985, the exact time Sarah and Amy disappeared. The officer at the table made a small note next to his name, and added the file to the priority list. The sampling went smoothly. Pike signed, submitted a saliva sample, and left. No one paid attention, but when the file reached Montgomery, Dr. Rachel Monroe immediately noticed something odd. Pike's signature on the current form was completely different from the one in the old 1984 file, when he'd been briefly interrogated after Amy's disappearance. The old handwriting was firm, even, and slanted right. The new one slanted left, shaky as if deliberately altered. Monroe placed the two papers side by side, stared for a long time, then called Hawkins. "Do you remember Jesse Pike?" she asked. Hawkins hesitated. "Yes. He lived near Cypress Lake, said he worked nights in Montgomery, so he had an alibi." "Are you sure it's the same person?" Monroe pressed. He sighed. "I think so, but he's changed a lot. Back then he was thinner, no beard." She suggested rechecking the files. In the archives, Monroe found a 1984 Polaroid of Pike, cold inscrutable eyes. Compared to the new photo, the face was nearly identical. Monroe marked Pike's sample in red, and sent it into the priority STR testing system. The following days, Prattville sank into tension. News of the DNA drive covered the papers. Townspeople debated. Supporters called it the last hope. Opponents saw it as an invasion of freedoms. But amid the fear was a fragile faith that after 20 years, justice was slowly returning. In Montgomery, Monroe worked through many nights. The lab lights stayed on late, the steady hum of the analyzer machines filling the air. She checked each graph on the screen. Most samples were unrelated, but at sample number 247, she froze. The STR sequence matched perfectly with the male DNA found on the hair clip and lace fabric. Not nearly matching, but an absolute match. Monroe stared at the screen, then called Hawkins. "You should sit down," she said slowly. "Jesse Pike's sample matches the DNA in both cases perfectly." Hawkins went silent, his hand trembling slightly on the phone. "Are you sure?" he asked. "The probability of error is 1 in 10 quintillion, Monroe replied. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. 20 years of investigation, 20 years of waiting, and finally, a name stood out clearly. The next day, Monroe sent the official report: DNA match confirmed, Jesse Pike. Probability of error, 1 in 10 quintillion. She printed it, clipping it with photos of Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins. Hawkins read it, folding it slowly. Outside the window, sunset draped over the cypress trees around Cypress Lake, where it all began. He knew that after 2 decades, Prattville was about to face the truth. The past had stopped being silent. The DNA confirmation report kept Sheriff Earl Hawkins awake all night. The results were crystal clear: but he still couldn't understand why would Jesse Pike, if truly the perpetrator, voluntarily submit a DNA sample. An ordinary person wouldn't be that foolish, unless there was something else. And the answer came just a few days later. On Monday morning, Hawkins got a call from Roy Turner, Pike's old co-worker at the Montgomery bakery. His voice was low and shaky. "Sheriff, I think there's something you need to know. Pike wasn't the one who went for the test that day." Hawkins froze. "What do you mean?" He asked a guy named Carl Henley, who works with him at the shop, to submit the sample for him. Said it was just administrative paperwork, nothing serious. "Now I see this isn't normal at all." Hawkins immediately informed Dr. Rachel Monroe. She was silent for a few seconds, then said, "That explains why the signature on the file doesn't match." Monroe rechecked the collection data. There were 2 envelopes, both labeled Jesse Pike, but with different entry times. One on the sampling day, one a few days later. "Sheriff," she said, "it's possible the first sample is fake. Someone went in Pike's place." Hawkins ordered a review of the security cameras at the hall. The footage was blurry, but clear enough to recognize that the man who came to submit the sample that day wasn't Pike. The man in the video was taller, balding, accompanied by 2 co-workers, Carl Henley himself. Montgomery police quickly located Henley at his small apartment near the market. At first, he denied it, but when Hawkins showed the footage and mentioned the matching DNA results in the case, Henley paled. "I was just doing what Jesse asked," he said. "He said he was afraid of being wrongly suspected, asked me to go in his place. I swear I didn't know anything else." Monroe requested reanalysis of the old sample. The results confirmed. The first sample submitted by Henley didn't match the crime scene DNA, while the second one, sent as a supplement afterward, matched perfectly. That meant Pike had deliberately swapped samples, but hadn't anticipated that his real one would be tested. He wanted to fool the system, Monroe concluded, but science moved faster than he thought. Hawkins immediately obtained a court order to collect a direct sample from Pike, this time under forensic supervision. The order was signed the same day. That afternoon, 3 police cars arrived at the Montgomery bakery. Pike was kneading dough when Hawkins walked in. "We need you to come with us to clear things up," he said gently. Pike pursed his lips, trying to stay calm. "I've already submitted, there must be a mix-up," he replied. Hawkins looked him straight in the eye. "Then help us verify it." At the police station, the sampling procedure took place in front of Monroe and a forensic witness. Pike's hand shook as he signed, trying to keep his voice steady. The saliva sample was sealed on the spot and sent straight into the STR system. Hawkins watched through the glass, his face tense but his gaze resolute. He'd waited for this moment for 20 years. The next morning, the results arrived. Monroe called, her voice firm. "Pike's direct sample matches the DNA found in both cases perfectly. No margin for error, no room for denial." She sent the official confirmation email, "Full STR match. Jesse Pike. Probability of error, 1 in 10 quintillion." Hawkins printed the report, staring at that number for a long time. 20 years, hundreds of false leads, countless sleepless nights, and finally, just one DNA sample to close the circle. He wondered how Pike had lived all these years carrying the guilt. A murderer right in the middle of Prattville, baking bread, greeting neighbors, talking to police, and still believing he could get away. The news was kept internal to prepare for the arrest warrant. Hawkins knew that once it broke, Prattville would be shaken again. But this time, it wouldn't be fear, it would be justice restored. He looked out the window, where early sunlight bathed the cypress trees around Cypress Lake, where it all began. The wind blew through, carrying the whisper of 2 names he'd never forgotten, Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins. Now, at last, they had someone speaking for them. Sheriff Earl Hawkins stood motionless in his office, the morning light falling on the freshly printed report. Dr. Rachel Monroe's terse line, "Full STR match. Jesse Pike. Probability of error 1 in 10 quintillion." struck like a hammer blow against 20 years of silence. Finally, all doubts were ended. Jesse Pike was the one who killed Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins. When Hawkins called Monroe, his voice was hoarse. "You've just closed 20 years of haunting in Prattville." Monroe replied, "No, sir, you're the one who never gave up." To her, DNA was just a tool. It was Hawkins' persistence that had kept justice alive through 2 decades. That very day, an emergency meeting was held at the Autauga County Prosecutor's office. Hawkins brought the entire old file, the faded photos, handwritten statements, and even the map of County Road 40. He presented it briefly. "Pike's DNA sample matches the male trace from both cases perfectly, the hairpin from Amy and the lace fabric scrap from Sarah. 2 cases, 1 man." The meeting room fell silent. Lead prosecutor Linda Garrett asked, "Do we have any supplemental evidence beyond the DNA?" Hawkins flipped back to an old report page in 1982. Pike lived just half a mile from Sarah's crime scene. In 1984, he appeared near Cypress Lake, where Amy's bag was found. He had a green pickup truck, matching the witness description. "This evidence was overlooked before," Hawkins said. "Now the DNA ties it all together." Monroe projected the STR graph on the screen, with the gene segments matching perfectly. "Error rate near 0, she said. "No one but Jesse Pike could have left this trace." The entire room went quiet. 20 years of investigation, hundreds of hypotheses, all boiled down to a single simple DNA chart. As everyone left the room, Hawkins stayed behind, gazing at the photo of Sarah and Amy on the wall. 2 young girls, innocent smiles, eyes looking forward as if they'd never known evil. He whispered, "I promised your mothers, and now I can keep my word." That afternoon, Hawkins and Monroe drove to Montgomery to report to the city police. On the road, the wind carried the scent of damp earth around Cypress Lake. "It's strange," Monroe said. "DNA is just strings of characters, but it knows how to tell the story that people forgot." Hawkins nodded. "It's the one thing that doesn't lie." When the car stopped in front of the bakery where Pike worked, Hawkins looked through the window. He was wiping the counter, chatting and laughing with customers, the harmless middle-aged man's mild demeanor. No one could imagine that man had once choked the life out of 2 16-year-old girls. Hawkins said softly, "He's lived peacefully too long. Time to end it." The next morning, May 9, 2002, the arrest warrant was signed. When the police entered the bakery, Pike was pulling a tray of bread from the oven. Hawkins stepped forward, voice calm. "Jesse Pike, you're under arrest for involvement in 2 murders in Prattville." Flour still clinging to his hands fell to the floor. "No way," Pike stammered. "I didn't do anything." Hawkins replied curtly, "DNA doesn't lie." At the Montgomery Police Headquarters, Pike stayed silent. His lawyer demanded to see the evidence. When Monroe placed the test results on the table, no one said another word. She explained briefly, "His DNA matches the crime scene trace perfectly. Probability of error is virtually 0. The lawyer just bowed his head, while Pike stared blankly at the paper, sweat beading on his forehead. When questioned about the time periods in 1982 and 1984, he hedged, "I worked nights in Montgomery. Might have passed through Prattville a few times." Hawkins looked him straight in the eye, and each time a girl disappeared. Pike fell silent, eyes down, hands trembling slightly on the table. Just then Monroe received an additional report from the forensics lab. The old fingerprints on Amy's hairpin, once too unclear, had been rescanned with new technology, and matched Pike's fingerprints perfectly, on file from a 1983 traffic violation. When she placed the results paper in front of him, Pike closed his eyes briefly, shoulders shaking lightly. No confession needed, his silence said it all. Hawkins stood up, signaling the officer to take notes. 20 years, he said slowly, and finally, we know his name. News of Jesse Pike's arrest spread quickly through Prattville. Evening TV broadcasts opened with bold text, "Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins cases. Killer caught after 20 years. Residents gathered in front of First Baptist Church, hugging and crying. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore watched the news on TV, nodding faintly, voice choked. "Finally, my child, he's been caught." That night, Hawkins returned to the county office. He pulled 2 old file folders from the metal cabinet and placed them on the desk. Amid the yellowed pages, he wrote the final line in red pen: "Case closed. DNA confirmed." He sat still for a long time, staring at the words he'd just written. 20 years of waiting, and justice had finally arrived, slow but certain. Outside, the church bells rang, echoing long in the quiet air. For the first time in 2 decades, Prattville could sleep peacefully, because finally, the truth had been named. The church bells still rang the next quiet morning, but this time, it wasn't the toll of peace. As the sun just rose above the steeple of St. Peter Church in Montgomery, police had already surrounded the grounds. Inside, Jesse Pike, the once model baker, active church member, was arranging chairs for Sunday service. He didn't know that in just minutes, his life would end like a curtain falling on a 20-year drama. Sheriff Earl Hawkins and 2 officers entered through the main door, while others circled to the back. When he saw them, Pike froze, still holding the wooden chair. "Mr. Pike," Hawkins said, voice low and steady, "you're under arrest for the murders in 2 Prattville cases in 1982 and 1984. A flash of shock crossed his face, quickly replaced by a weak smile. "You're mistaken, Sheriff," he said softly. "I've atoned for my mistakes. I'm not that person anymore." Hawkins looked him straight in the eye. "We'll talk about that later. For now, come with us." As the cold cuffs snapped around Pike's wrists, a few churchgoers began to gather. They thought it was an intruder, but then fell silent when they saw who was being escorted out. "Jesse," a woman's voice rang out. "No way." A young pastor rushed up, asking rapid fire what was happening, but Hawkins just said curtly, "We have an official arrest warrant." Pike bowed his head, lips trembling. He didn't look at anyone, just murmured prayers as he was led outside. News spread like wildfire. As the police car left Montgomery, the local radio was already reporting a 52-year-old man arrested for the murder of 2 teenage girls in Prattville 20 years ago. By noon, TV stations across Alabama were airing special bulletins, replaying footage of Pike in handcuffs being led from the church, a familiar face to many in the community. He'd been praised as the model neighbor, the baker for town festivals, donor to the church, and Bible study teacher for children. In Prattville, Jesse Pike's arrest stunned the whole town. At the Central Diner, people abandoned their breakfasts, glued to the TV screen. "Is that him?" someone stammered. "Jesse Pike. I used to buy bread from his shop," a woman said shakily. "I let my daughter go to choir practice at church with him." Oh God. Memories of Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins flooded back like old wounds torn open. Residents were horrified, not just at knowing the killer's name, but that he'd lived among them, in the guise of the decent man they'd trusted. That afternoon, the media descended on Prattville. In front of First Baptist Church, where Sarah once sang in the choir, residents gathered, bringing flowers and photos of the 2 girls. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, silver-haired, stood silently watching the crowd. A reporter asked her feelings. She just said softly, "I don't feel hate, just emptiness, because he lived right among us, and no one recognized it." In the county office, Hawkins watched the news replay of the arrest scene. He wasn't happy, not relieved, just tired. 20 years of pursuit, and the outcome was a familiar face in the community. "Justice comes late, but it still comes," he said to Monroe when she walked in. She nodded, eyes mixed with respect and sadness. That night, Prattville didn't sleep. The press lit up the town, news vans parked full around Cypress Lake. But amid the flashing lights, the church bells rang again, slow, heavy, and sad. It wasn't just bidding farewell to the 2 girls from years ago, but also to the illusion of peace that Prattville once believed it had. The church bells that night still rang slowly and sadly as Jesse Pike was brought into the interrogation room in Montgomery. The small room, lit by cold fluorescent lights, had only a metal table, 2 chairs, and a one-way mirror. Sheriff Earl Hawkins sat across from him, placing the thick file in front of him. On the cover was a handwritten, yellowed line: Sarah Whitmore, Amy Collins. The 2 names made Pike bow his head. He'd been silent since the arrest, and as the door closed, Hawkins knew the psychological battle had begun. "Jesse," he said, voice steady, "you're a smart man. You know we didn't arrest the wrong person. The DNA sample can't be wrong." Pike didn't look up, just pursed his lips. "I don't know anything about those 2 girls," he replied, voice hoarse and low. "I've lived well, worked, prayed. I'm not the man you're looking for." Hawkins looked at him for a long moment, then opened the file, flipping through the pages. He placed on the table a photo of the broken hairpin, evidence found with Amy's bag in 1984. "Do you recognize this?" Pike glanced briefly, then shook his head. "Never seen it." Hawkins nodded slightly, not rushing to react. He opened another plastic envelope, pulling out the white lace fabric scrap found near Sarah's bicycle. "What about this?" Pike didn't answer. His eyes lingered for a moment, then turned away. "I told you, I don't know anything." Hawkins leaned back in his chair, voice low but firm. "The problem is your DNA is on both these items, Jesse. It's been there for 20 years waiting for us to find it." The air in the room thickened. Hawkins let the silence stretch, a technique he'd used in countless interrogations. Finally, Pike sighed, voice trembling slightly. "I did know Sarah. She came to the bakery. I sold to her a few times." Hawkins showed no surprise. "And Amy Collins?" "No, I never met her. But your DNA is on both their things. How do you explain that?" Pike fell silent, fingers tapping lightly on the metal table. Hawkins played an old tape recording, the 1984 statement from Pike, when Amy went missing. In it, his voice was younger, more confident. "That night I worked late, didn't leave Montgomery." Hawkins stopped the tape, looking straight at him. "You said you worked late, but no one confirmed it. The bakery owner back then wasn't sure you were there. You said you didn't have a truck, but witnesses saw a green pickup, the one you bought in 1982. Want to say that again?" Pike swallowed hard, voice fading low. "I just wanted to help. She said her bike was broken. I stopped." Hawkins seized that weakness immediately. "Sarah, yes, I just wanted to give her a ride home. She was scared, said her mom was waiting. I didn't mean to hurt her, but..." He stopped, clenching his fists, sweat dripping onto the table. "She screamed. I just wanted her to be quiet." Hawkins sat still, his heart pounding fast, but he didn't interrupt. Pike continued, voice choked. "I pulled her off the road to the edge of the woods. She fell, hit her head on a rock. I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I left her there." He looked up, eyes weary. "I didn't mean to kill her, I swear." Monroe, standing behind the one-way mirror, watched Hawkins nod slightly. But he knew more was needed. "What about Amy Collins, Jesse?" 2 years later, same road, same kind of disappearance. Pike went quiet, but his hand shook. "No more lies. You left your trace on her hairpin." He gave a bitter laugh, hoarse and desperate. "No way. I buried everything deep. So how do you know about the hairpin?" Hawkins pressed, voice cold. Pike froze, realizing he'd just said something never publicly disclosed. No one but the police and Monroe knew that evidence existed. The silence stretched, then he bowed his head. I did meet that girl. I saw her walking alone, after the fair. I just wanted to talk. She got scared, ran. I pulled her back. Things went further than I thought." He paused, eyes empty. "I don't know why I did it. Maybe because after Sarah, I couldn't sleep. I just wanted to control it." Hawkins went quiet. He took notes on every word, knowing he was hearing the killer recount exactly what had haunted him for 20 years. When he stopped, he just asked, "Do you remember what you did to them?" Pike closed his eyes, voice like a man exhausted. "I left them near the creek. I thought the water would wash it away. But I still hear their voices, all these years." When the interrogation ended, the transcript ran nearly 10 pages. Monroe entered the room, eyes holding back emotion. "He just convicted himself," she said softly. "Details about the hairpin and lace that were never released. Can't deny it anymore." Hawkins nodded, gathering the file, looking toward Pike slumped over the table. 20 years ago, Hawkins had promised he wouldn't stop until he found who did it. Now, as the confession echoed in the cold room, he felt relief, but heavier than ever. Outside, rain fell over Montgomery, the steady patter like the breath of justice, slow, persistent, but finally arriving. The rain continued to fall steadily outside the glass window as Jesse Pike was led out of the interrogation room. Sheriff Earl Hawkins stood watching him go, his heart filled with a mix of relief and emptiness. 20 years of pursuit, and finally, he had confessed. But Hawkins knew the journey wasn't truly over. Justice didn't stop in the interrogation room. It was only completed when the truth was publicly judged in court. 3 months later, the Montgomery County Courthouse opened the trial of Jesse Pike in the case of the state of Alabama versus Jesse L. Pike on 2 counts, kidnapping and first-degree murder of Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins. On the day of the trial, hundreds of people gathered in front of the courthouse gates. Press, television crews, and residents from Prattville poured in, crowding the entire square. In the crowd, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore and Amy Collins's parents sat in the front row, their faces gaunt but calm. They had waited for this day for 2 decades. Courtroom number 3 echoed with the sound of the gavel. Judge Henry Dalton declared the trial begun. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Linda Garrett. The defense was Attorney Richard Lane, court-appointed. Jesse Pike entered, wearing a gray prison jumpsuit, gaunt and silent. He looked around, his gaze briefly meeting Hawkins, who sat in the row behind Monroe. No words were spoken, but between them were 20 years of silence broken. Garrett opened with a brief but firm statement. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that the defendant, Jesse Pike, is the man who abducted and murdered 2 young girls, Sarah Whitmore in 1982 and Amy Collins in 1984. For 20 years he lived among the community as a harmless man, while justice was buried with the victims. But science doesn't forget. His DNA, left on the evidence, is the silent witness that has waited until today to speak the truth." The courtroom fell silent as Garrett methodically presented the chain of evidence: STR test results from Dr. Rachel Monroe, the transcript of Pike's confession, and the investigation report on his fraudulent DNA submission. On the large screen, images of the evidence appeared: the broken hairpin of Amy's, the white lace fabric scrap of Sarah's, accompanied by genetic charts with perfect matches. Monroe was called to the witness stand. She presented clearly, step by step, the analysis process, from preserving the evidence in the state's cold storage to modern STR techniques that reconstructed DNA from minuscule samples. When defense attorney Lane rose to object, claiming the old samples could be contaminated or manipulated, Monroe calmly replied, "We tested the DNA sequence 3 times on 2 independent systems. The error rate is less than 1 in 10 trillion. There's no way to fabricate these results." The gavel sounded, and Judge Dalton declared the objection overruled. Next, Garrett presented Pike's fraudulent actions: how he had asked a colleague to submit a DNA sample in his place, then deliberately swapped samples to deceive the police. Surveillance footage from the auditorium and Carl Henley's testimony were shown on the screen, revealing the entire cover-up scheme. "An innocent man doesn't need to fake his identity," Garrett said, her eyes fixed on the defendant. "Only someone who knows he's guilty would fear that much." In the afternoon session, the court played the recording of Hawkins's interrogation. Pike's voice came through the speakers, choked and trembling. "I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted her to be quiet." As that sound filled the room, many in the gallery bowed their heads, while Mrs. Margaret gripped her hands tightly, tears falling without a sound. Attorney Lane tried to counterattack. He argued that the confession was coerced in a state of psychological weakness, and that Pike may only be responsible for an accident, not intentional murder. He also emphasized that there are no bodies, no direct eyewitnesses. But Garrett rebutted immediately, "We have physical evidence, detailed statements matching the scene, and the defendant's DNA, in both cases. That's not coincidence, that's the mark of the crime." Over 3 days of trial, witnesses took the stand one by one. Roy Turner recounted how Pike asked someone else to submit the sample, Carl Henley confirmed that he himself had gone in his place, and Monroe presented copies of the DNA results, with each matching gene column enlarged on the screen. Each time the charts appeared, the courtroom murmured, and Pike only bowed his head. On the 4th day, Garrett closed the prosecution's arguments. "For 20 years, Jesse Pike lived among us as a good man, baking pies, teaching Sunday school, and thinking the past would stay buried. But justice never sleeps. He didn't just kill 2 girls, he killed the trust of an entire town. Today, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have the chance to bring that trust back." Lane countered in desperation, "My client has changed. He's lived well for 20 years, committed no further crimes. This isn't a monster, but a man who once made a mistake." But his words dissolved into silence. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreman stood, his voice firm. "We, the jury of the state of Alabama, find the defendant Jesse L. Pike guilty of first-degree kidnapping and first-degree murder." The courtroom went still, then sobs rose from the spectator rows. Judge Dalton banged the gavel. "Based on the verdict, the court sentences the defendant to life imprisonment, without parole." Jesse Pike said nothing, only bowed his head. As the bailiffs let him out, he turned back to look at the row in the back, where Hawkins and Monroe sat. For a moment, his eyes held no anger or fear, just emptiness, as if finally, he accepted that all prayers were futile before the truth. Outside, the afternoon sun stretched long across the Montgomery courthouse steps. Hawkins stepped out into the crowd of reporters, but he only said one thing: "Justice comes slow, but it comes." Then he turned away, leaving behind the flurry of flashing cameras. That evening in Prattville, the bells of First Baptist Church rang again, not as mournful as before, but as the sound of release. Mrs. Margaret lit a small candle before her daughter's photo, whispering softly, "Sarah, you're at peace now." In the dim light, the old wounds of the small town finally began to heal. In the flickering light of the small candle before Sarah's framed photo, Prattville seemed to breathe a sigh of relief after 20 years in the shadows. But as the church bells faded, the town began to divide again. Not everyone believed Jesse Pike was truly the sole perpetrator. Some felt justice had arrived, but others were skeptical that the case still held something untold. In the days after the trial, local newspapers were filled with coverage. Some praised the triumph of science, hailing Dr. Rachel Monroe as the one who revived justice from the ashes of time. But there were also editorials questioning, can we fully trust DNA after 20 years? At the town cafe, conversations buzzed endlessly. A middle-aged man said, "I knew Pike, he was mild-mannered, church-going. I don't believe he could do that." A woman replied, "It's because we believed that facade that 2 girls died." Prattville was small, and debates like this dragged on for weeks, as if people still didn't know whether to feel relieved or empty. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, Sarah's mother, had no doubts left. She had heard the confession with her own ears, seen the verdict pronounced. At the post-trial press conference, when asked if she forgave Pike, she only replied softly, "I have nothing to forgive. I just want my daughter remembered for how she lived, not how she left." She sent thank you letters to Hawkins and Monroe, calling them those who didn't let this pain be buried. Amy Collins' family also returned to Prattville after years away. Her parents stood before Cypress Pond, where Amy's bag had once been found, carrying a bouquet of white flowers. Her elderly father said through choked emotion, "We owe this justice to those who never stopped searching, not just for Amy, but for all the other girls who might have been forgotten." Monroe was there with Hawkins that day, standing quietly at a distance, not wanting to intrude on the moment. She only felt relief, knowing her science was no longer cold numbers, but a voice for the voiceless. But not everyone found peace like that. Tommy Ray Caldwell, the young man wrongly suspected 20 years earlier, was now a 39-year-old man, living in Mobile. When he saw the news of Pike's verdict, he sat silently for a long time. For a long stretch after Sarah's disappearance, Tommy had been seen by the community as the suspect. He lost his job at the gas station, friends shunned him, his family had to move away. "I'll never forget their looks," he once said. "They looked at me like a murderer." A week after the trial, Tommy received an envelope from the Prattville police station. Inside was a handwritten letter from Sheriff Hawkins. The handwriting trembled, but was clear. "Tommy, I owe you an apology. 20 years ago, I let the pressure of the case make me see the wrong person. You've endured things you didn't deserve, and I want you to know, justice has finally proven your innocence. I hope you find the peace Sarah never had." Tommy read the letter over and over, then folded it carefully, and put it in the wooden box where he kept old mementos. He wasn't angry at Hawkins. In fact, he felt grateful. He did the right thing, he told a reporter. Not everyone has the courage to apologize publicly like that. In Prattville, the police held a small ceremony in the town hall courtyard to honor those involved in the investigation. Monroe received a commendation from the governor of Alabama for her contribution to the application of DNA technology in long unsolved cases. She stood humbly beside Hawkins, who received a minute-long standing ovation from the townspeople. When invited to speak, he only said, "Justice doesn't come from one person, it comes from all those who believe that truth, no matter how long buried, will still be found." After the ceremony, Hawkins walked down Prattville's main street, where missing person flyers for Sarah had once flooded the area. Now those papers had faded, but the memories never had. He knew that though justice had prevailed, no victory was truly complete. 2 young lives stolen, an innocent man wrongly suspected, and an entire town scarred indelibly. That afternoon, Hawkins stopped by First Baptist Church. He sat in the back pew, watching sunlight filter through the stained glass windows. On the wooden lectern up front, a new memorial plaque had been placed, in loving memory of Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins, lost, but never forgotten. Below it in smaller letters, dedicated by the people of Prattville, 2002. He touched the wood lightly, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun. In that moment, Hawkins understood that justice wasn't just a verdict, but the ability for a community to face its past. And for Prattville, that past had finally been named. Hawkins touched the memorial plaque lightly, his heart filled with a sense of closure. He knew that as the afternoon sun sank over Cypress Pond that day, his 20-year journey had reached its end. After the memorial ceremony, Sheriff Earl Hawkins submitted his retirement papers. He was 67, with silver-white hair, eyes still bright, but hiding the weariness of someone who had lived too long with memories of guilt and justice. All of Prattville turned out for his farewell, from young officers just starting out to residents who had followed the case for years. When invited to speak, he only said, "I've seen the dark side of humanity, but I've also seen the light of perseverance. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: justice never comes late. It just waits for those patient enough to seek it." Dr. Rachel Monroe also left Alabama, not long after. She accepted an invitation from FBI Quantico, where she was tasked with leading the team on the Cold Case DNA Initiative, a program to review and reopen long unsolved cases nationwide. At her send-off in Montgomery, Hawkins shook her hand for a long time. "You made the past tell the truth," he said. Monroe smiled, replying softly, "And you made sure justice didn't sleep." Then she left, carrying a folded map of Prattville in her bag, a reminder that truth can be found anywhere, if someone is willing to listen. A year later, the town of Prattville held a memorial ceremony for Sarah Whitmore and Amy Collins at the Cypress Pond Woods, where it all began. The sky was clear blue, a gentle breeze rippling the water, and hundreds of residents gathered around the new stone marker. Engraved on it were the words, "For every voice silenced, may truth speak again. For every voice silenced, let truth speak once more." Mrs. Margaret Whitmore placed a bouquet of white lilies at the base of the marker. Amy's parents stood beside her, hands clasped. They said nothing, just gazed out at the still water, where secrets had been held captive for 2 decades. Hawkins, now retired, was there too, standing quietly at the back of the crowd. He wore no uniform, just an old man in a wide-brimmed hat, eyes distant. As the memorial song rose, he bowed his head. All the weight in his heart seemed to dissolve with the wind. Prattville had changed too. Old houses were repainted. County Road 40, the road once tied to fear, had been widened, with a new sign, Whitmore, Collins Way. School children passed by it every day, few remembering it as a crime scene, but the adults still did. Each year, on December 19th, First Baptist Church still held a small prayer service for the unheard souls. In the old office, the Whitmore, Collins case file was bound in leather and placed in a glass case at the police station, beside a plaque reading, "Solved after 20 years, a milestone in Alabama justice." Young police cadets were brought to see it as a classic lesson in perseverance, the role of science, and faith in justice. In Washington, D.C., Rachel Monroe occasionally still received handwritten letters from Prattville, from school children, from residents, even from Tommy Ray Caldwell. One letter read, "Thanks to you and Sheriff Hawkins, we can believe justice is real." She kept those letters on her desk at Quantico, amid stacks of new files. Each time she started another case, she glanced at the photo of Cypress Pond pinned to her board, the one Hawkins sent her before he left office, to remind herself that no matter how long it took, truth was always waiting to be found. As for Hawkins, he chose a quiet life in the suburbs of Prattville, a few miles from Cypress Pond. Occasionally, people saw him biking through town, stopping at the church, chatting with new faces. When asked if he had regrets, he only smiled. "I regret we didn't find out sooner. But I know slow justice is still justice." 20 years of silence had closed with a truth, and Prattville, though scarred, had learned to rise from the pain. The story of Sarah and Amy became a symbol for cold cases in Alabama, proof that time could fade memories, but not erase the traces of guilt. Each fall, the wind from Cypress Pond blew through the cypress trees, carrying the distant sound of church bells. Those bells no longer tolled in lament, but as a gentle reminder that somewhere in the American South, a small town had learned to trust again, in justice, in people, and in the power of truth. Looking from the Prattville story to America today, there are a few very real-life things: technology, community, and human perseverance. Rachel Monroe's use of STR-DNA to match traces on the hair clip and lace fragment, kept dry for 20 years with Jesse Pike's direct sample, reminds us that investing in forensic science, evidence preservation processes, and cold case budgets is not a luxury, but a responsibility. Support local budgets for labs, demand police departments update preservation standards, paper instead of plastic for biological evidence, and consider participating in voluntary DNA donation as per regulations, because Prattville's Operation Dragnet only works when people cooperate. On the other hand, the town that nearly broke apart due to rumors, Tommy Ray was seen as the killer just for passing by the old road. The lesson for the social media era is don't share unverified suspicions, prioritize official sources, and remember that a public apology, like Sheriff Hawkins' letter, has real healing power. On community safety, blind spots like the stretch of County Road 40, the trail to Cypress Pond, and going home alone after the fair show very specific solutions: good lighting, community cameras, safe walking routes, church-school safe walk models, and educating kids on refusal skills, calling 911, real-time location sharing. For churches, small businesses, where Pike hid as an upstanding person, Need appropriate background check policies when working with teens. Finally, nurture trust but not gullibility. Trust science, DNA matching, digitized fingerprints, trust legal processes, public trials, and trust the community's ability to heal, like the memorial plaque at Cypress Pond and the Whitmore, Collins Way Road, because justice may come late, but we decide whether it arrives at all. If you believe that justice can come late, but never disappears, hit subscribe to the channel to join us in continuing to explore cases solved after decades of silence. Thank you for joining us on the Prattville story. See you in the next video, where the past speaks once again.